Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started on time this evening. I'm June Gebhardt, president of Ohio Association of Garden Clubs, and I want to welcome all of you to our presentation tonight by Zoom by Ruth Bowell. And we're going to talk about monarchs being our pollinator ambassador. And Marina Lejeune, will you please introduce Ruth for us?
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am glad you're all here. I'm Marina Lejeune, the Nature and Conservation Chair for Ohio Association of Garden Clubs. April is a very special month for nature and conservation. We celebrate Earth Day, Arbor Day, Native Plant Month. Everything is happening in April. So I'm very excited that we can offer this event tonight as part of our celebration. Our speaker tonight is Ruth Bowell. Ruth is Monarch butterfly citizen scientist. She has been interested in monarchs since childhood when she was helping her grandmother to take care of monarch butterflies. Ruth has been working with Alpha Garden Club and the city of Troy on monarch butterfly habitat. That habitat is located in Treasure Island Park in Troy. I personally visited that habitat, and let me tell you, it's pretty spectacular. I highly recommend for you to make a trip there and see for yourselves the beauty of all the butterflies and insects and wildlife. And maybe you will get inspired and do something like that in your own communities. Ruth also created and certified her own yard, which is 1 acre habitat, mostly for pollinators, but she also has a variety of wildlife visiting her habitat. In addition to that, Ruth is an owner of the Milkweed Patch. It's a business that's located in Troy, and the business is specializing in plants that benefit pollinators. Today, Ruth will help us to discover more about monarch's fascinating life cycle, its migration, the current status of the population, and how this pollinator ambassador is bringing together people from across North America and making a big difference for many its fellow pollinators. Welcome, Ruth. We are eager to listen to your presentation.
Thank you, Marina and June, for that welcome. That was very nice. Again, my name is Ruth, and I am a member of the Alpha Garden Club, which is in Region 5, an OAGC garden club. Marina mentioned my grandmother, who was also a monarch butterfly aficionado, and she also was a very long time garden club member in the Youngstown area. So I want to take us on a journey which begins on March the 10th, 2022. Before I do that, though, I just want to mention that we will have time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions, go ahead and put those into the chat if you'd like, or just write them down so that I can try and answer those at the end. So again, our journey, which begins about a week ago, high in the mountains of central Mexico. There, a monarch butterfly is preparing to migrate. And I need to move this screen here. There we go. Preparing to migrate north from her winter sanctuary. She has been there since November. She went there to escape the freezing temperatures of the United States and Canada, and she spent most of the winter in clusters on the oyamel fir trees there. Her ancient forest consists of pine and oyamel fir trees, which create a microclimate that provides shelter when temperatures fall to freezing or there are winter rains. These locations provide cool temperatures, so between 55 and 59 degrees, water, and adequate shelter that protects her from predators and allows her to conserve enough energy so she can survive the winter. On sunny days, she's warmed enough that she can take flight. The cluster that she was hanging with just bursts from the trees. And I don't know if you can hear that, but there are so many monarchs, you can actually hear them flying. She joins a swarm that seeks nearby water, which she needs to convert her stored fat to energy. As the day length increases, she mates. After mating, our female monarch begins flying north in search of milkweed. She finds tender milkweed just emerging in Texas, Louisiana, and along the Gulf Coast. After laying all of her eggs in these southern states, the 8-month-old monarch dies. Her children are born, and about a month later, become adults and move further north. As you'll see, it takes multiple generations before we see them again in Ohio. By early May, the milkweed will be putting out new growth in the central United States. The first generation of monarchs will arrive, mate, and more eggs will be deposited. By early June, the second generation is born and moves further north following the milkweed. The adults arrive in the Midwest by June. The adults continue to mate and lay eggs throughout July and August on any available milkweed they can find. These first 4 to 5 generations of monarchs live 3 or 4 weeks, mating and increasing the population throughout the eastern US and southern Canada. Monarchs only lay eggs on milkweed plants. It's the only thing a monarch caterpillar can eat. They usually lay 1 egg per plant, usually on the underside of the milkweed plants and milkweed leaves. We'll talk more about milkweed a little later. After 3 or 4 weeks, once all of her 300 to 400 eggs are deposited, the monarch dies. Within a few days, the eggs begin to hatch and the life cycle of the next generation begins. Monarch caterpillars grow quickly, and they're full grown in 2 weeks when they enter the next stage of the life cycle, the chrysalis. After 2 weeks in the chrysalis, or approximately 1 month after the egg was laid, the adult monarch butterfly ecloses. This is also known as complete metamorphosis, this cycle. 1 in 100 eggs makes it to adulthood. Summer monarchs live about 2 to 5 weeks. There's no growth in this adult period, so all of their growth was done as a caterpillar. They do, however, need to obtain nourishment to maintain their body and fuel it for flight. And they do that with a proboscis, which is their feeding mechanism. And this is normally coiled under their head unless they're feeding. They'll get nectar from flowers, which provides most of their adult food. Monarchs, the adults, will visit many different types of flowers, so not just milkweed. They have taste receptors on their feet to find the nectar, and also the females use their taste receptors to detect milkweed where they can lay their eggs. Monarchs are sexually dimorphic, and that means that the males and the females look different. Can you guess in this photo, or do you know which adult here is the female? How about now? Males have swollen pouches on their hind wing that looks like dots. So the one on the top is the male. And in case you can't see that swollen pouch, there I've circled it. So the females don't have that particular cell. Also, if you'll notice, the female's coloring is darker. The lines on her body, on her wings, I should say, are much darker. I often tell the kids if they wanted to draw a monarch, if they wanted to be a male, they should use a sharp pencil. But if they want to make it a female, maybe they should use a marker. You can also tell from the chrysalis if it's going to be male or female. So I'm highlighting a line here that only shows up, and I believe that is the female. The adult monarchs that are born in late fall, so this would be late August and September here in Ohio, somehow sense the arrival of colder temperatures and they start to behave differently than their parents or even their grandparents. These monarchs do not mate. Their fat stores really increase. They begin to fly south, searching for high quality nectar from fall blooming flowers. The monarchs that are born east of the Rocky Mountains continue flying south until they reach the same overwintering sites, which are high in the mountains of central Mexico, which their great grandparents came to last November. They arrive in their overwintering grounds just as the Mexican people are celebrating the Day of the Dead. So that's about the 1st of November. And some cultures believe that these are the returning souls of their departed. There's a couple of other monarch populations in the US. Those that are west of the Rockies migrate to coastal areas of Southern California, and some that live in Florida don't migrate. They don't have a need, so they just have year-round colonies. Just as monarchs have a life cycle from egg to butterfly, they also have an annual cycle of spring and fall migration, which repeats itself every year. But no individual monarch completes the entire annual cycle. It's still a mystery how the 4th or 5th generations find the Mexican overwintering grounds when none of those that are going have ever been there before. These Mexican overwintering grounds were also a mystery to us until they were discovered just not so very long ago in 1975. Canadians Fred and Nora Urquhart spent the better part of their adult lives trying to figure out where the monarchs went. They recruited volunteers from across Canada and the US to help them apply small stickers or tags to the wings of monarch butterflies and then report any tagged butterflies that were found. These volunteers were some of the earliest citizen scientists. Citizen scientists collect local data for research and share it with professional scientists to answer real-world questions. Here's just a sample of the type of sticker they used then, and we'll talk more about this in just a minute. The Urquharts hired an American, Ken Bruger, to help them locate the monarchs. Ken traveled through Mexico and met and married Kathy or Catalina Trail, who was a Mexican woman that you see here. She helped him communicate with the Mexican people and search for the monarchs. And in January of 1975, they discovered the first colony, and then they found 5 more. Ken and Kathy witnessed a grand spectacle in 1975, a colony with billions of overwintering monarchs. The monarchs were numerous and the sanctuaries were undeveloped at that point, so it was hard to move without stepping on any butterflies. When Fred Urquhart visited the sanctuary the following year, he found a dead monarch butterfly. It had been tagged by 2 schoolboys and their teacher from Chaska, Minnesota in August of 1975. He knew he had found his monarchs. National Geographic reported on this discovery in their August of 1976 issue, and Kathy was featured on the cover. It didn't take long for the Mexican government to recognize the importance of this natural asset. The oil mill forests were being logged by the local people, and it became apparent that the sites needed to be preserved so as to sustain the monarchs over winter. The land, however, was and still is owned by local families who did not want the government to oversee its use. In 1986, the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve was established with 12 known sanctuaries. Several sites are open to the public from November through March, but only a few have the supportive infrastructure so that people can visit without harming the monarchs. Now the families who still own the land are able to earn money from those that visit the sanctuaries, and they work to protect the areas. Things have changed dramatically since Fred and Nora first visited the overwintering monarchs. Logging had mostly stopped, but then the pandemic hit and things have really picked up again. The number of monarchs overwintering has also steadily declined, and that decline is anywhere from 80 to 90% from what it was when they were first discovered. So how can we say that this population is in decline? Well, personnel from the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve began assessing the monarch population in 1994. When would be the best time to count monarchs? Well, that would be during the coldest winter months when the monarchs stay clustered on the trees. The trees that are occupied by monarchs, which you can see here circled, those trees that appear to be burnt or possibly dead, are actually covered in monarchs, which is why they appear to be orange. So they mark these trees and then they estimate the area that's covered by those trees. There's special mapping software that can be used to compute the surface area of each colony. The colony size is reported in hectares. 1 hectare is about 2.5 acres, or about the size of 2.5 football fields. There's an estimated 50 million individuals per hectare. The all-time high was recorded in 1996. There was over 18 hectares estimated. And the all-time low was not so long ago, not even 20 years after that initial high was recorded. And that's when it was less than 1 hectare. So again, we have almost 30 years of data on the monarch population in the overwintering sites of Mexico, and we can see that there's a general declining trend in the numbers. The winter of 2013 had the lowest ever recorded at 0.67 hectares. We got a little worried that year. Then there was a slight increase in 2014, but this number was still the second lowest ever recorded, or 1.13 hectares. The goal for monarch conservation efforts is 6 hectares, indicated by that dashed line. We hit that in 2018 when the conditions were perfect for monarchs. Pardon me. Our average for 2004 to 2020 is 3.34 hectares. Usually by now we have the counts from the past winter, but there seems to be something, and it's possibly political in nature, that's delaying the release of those numbers this year, which is a real bummer, as I like to share those numbers and hope that they're good. But in fact, Chip Taylor, who is the director of Monarch Watch at the University of Kansas, estimates that this year's population will be between 0.8 and 1.2 hectares. He has a formula that he uses every year to try and estimate that. Ouch, that's something we haven't seen that low for 8 seasons. So I hope his prediction is not correct. So why are we seeing the declines, not only in monarchs, but in all pollinators or insects who support the food web that we rely on? After all, insects are the food. They come from, butterflies come from caterpillars, and caterpillars are food for everything else. And insects make the food through pollination. The number one reason, maybe you can guess, is habitat loss. 160 million acres have been converted to agriculture since 1996. 140 million of those to corn and soybeans. And that's due in a large part to the renewable fuel standard in 2007 and the need for biofuel. There's also intensive agricultural practices that reduce the field margins around crops. And also the management of our roadsides and utility right-of-ways. We do a lot of mowing and application of herbicides to maintain those. Number two then is probably our use of pesticides. And pesticides is the overarching term for everything that ends in side. Insecticide, herbicide, fungicide, all of those sides. But there's a particularly worrisome class of insecticides called neonicotinoids or neonics. These chemicals are applied to nursery plants and are used to control aphids, thrips, and whiteflies. It can be in the form of a soil drench, coating the seeds, or spraying the plants directly. It's a systemic pesticide, meaning it's absorbed by all parts of the plant, and it can be found in not only the plant, but the nectar and the pollen. So milkweed that's been treated with a neonic will kill a monarch caterpillar. Climate change is also affecting a lot of things, and that's also leading to the decline in this population. So other habitat loss includes the new development that's happening. It claims about 2.2 million acres per year in the United States. There's an estimated 40 million acres of lawn just in the lower 48. And the study that was done some time ago says that turf grass is actually our single largest irrigated crop. We also apply a lot of pesticides to our lawns and landscape plants, and we think our roadsides need to look like this particular lawn. So also wanted to point out that grass in itself is really only good for a couple of creatures, and that would be Japanese beetles, their grubs, and Canada geese. There was a time when milkweed commonly grew between crop rows. Then in 1996, the first herbicide tolerant crops were introduced. Herbicide, again, is a pesticide. This was readily adopted by 1999. And that's when we began to see the sharp decline in monarch tag recoveries. You can see that the use of herbicide tolerant corn, that is, and soybeans has increased over the last 20 plus years. By 2004, the adoption of these crops exceeded 51%. The adoption rate by 2010 was 81%. Milkweeds are now scarce in this formerly productive habitat. As a society, we've moved from family farms to corporate agriculture and intensive farming practices. A lot of monocultures also exist. So if the herbicides don't kill the milkweed, the lack of space does. I mentioned climate change. It's more than just our weather. It's affecting all parts of the monarch's habitat in North America, which also results in some habitat loss. So as a result of climate change, we have a lot of things that are going up, including temperatures. At the same time, there's a lot of things coming down, like our snow covers and ice. There's two indicators in particular that affect monarchs, and that would be the shifting tree lines and species migrating. So what that means is when they get to the overwintering grounds in Mexico, will those oyamel fir trees, which have a certain altitude on which they grow, will those trees need to be migrating up further? And that takes a long time to happen. But then also in terms of the migration, will the monarch start migrating before the milkweed is available? Just some things to keep in mind. But why should we, those of us that are in the Midwest anyway, care about the cause of monarch declines? Well, that's because through lots of studies, they've found that the majority of monarch butterflies that overwinter in Mexico actually were born in the Midwest. So what's the outlook for 2022? Well, we can track the migration, both the spring and the fall migration, through an organization called Journey North. And they have a website where you can go all year long, but in particular in the spring and again in the fall, to report your sightings of milkweed. So when you see your first milkweed emerging, if you have some, you can go there and report that your milkweed is emerging. When you see your first monarch butterfly, I know I always see the eggs or the caterpillars before I see a butterfly, so you can also report those. And then in the fall, if you have a group of monarchs that are roosting in a part of your property, you can report that and give an estimate of how many monarchs you think are resting in that overnight roost. They provide the map that you see on the screen on their website. It's interactive, so you can hit the play button and it will show you from week to week where the monarchs are. They also have one for hummingbirds, so you can track hummingbirds and see if they're getting close to your neck of the woods. But we can see from here that the migration has already reached Oklahoma. So we will most likely start seeing the offspring maybe as early as mid-May. June is generally the time that we would start really noticing monarchs in our area, though. So I'd like to just introduce a list that I've ranked as important, determined by myself, of ways that you can help this monarch population and other pollinators at the same time. The first is to preserve or create milkweed habitat. So if you know of a stand of milkweed, even along the side of the highway, you can do whatever you can to try and make sure that that doesn't get mowed down. If you don't have milkweed in your own yard, you can establish some milkweed plantings. And both of those will create that pollinator habitat. But then also consider the monarch's life cycle. So we have that egg that goes into caterpillar, chrysalis, and adult. We can affect all the stages by eliminating those pesticides, also removing any invasive plants, supporting or advocating for change to our roadside practices and any local weed ordinances that might be in place. You can also try and talk to your local officials. So that would include, again, Department of Transportation, maybe the mayor in your area, any elected officials or those that might have power to change things. Anyone actually that will listen, just as you are listening tonight. And then also get involved in citizen science, if that's your thing. You may have noticed that my list of ways to help didn't include bringing in eggs and caterpillars and rearing them to adults. And these are just my thoughts on captive rearing. Everyone has to make their own decision. I know there's probably those of you that are listening in that do enjoy rearing caterpillars. I still do some limited rearing for educational purposes, but providing the habitat really is what I strive to do in my own practice. But there has been a lot of evidence released in the past couple of years. There's a article that you can find on the Monarch Joint Venture website that shows there's just really no scientific evidence that rearing actually results in an overall population increase. And it's a lot of work. And it's also known to carry risk. There's a number of reports that indicate that rearing may affect a monarch's ability to migrate in the right direction. There's also been reports that have disputed that. So, you know, again, it's just information maybe to cause further learning. There was a recent report just in the last couple of months that also talked about the increase of a specific monarch disease. The disease is OE, and this increased significantly about the time people really started rearing lots of monarchs inside. That report is available on monarchscience.org if you wanted to read that. But let's get to some fun things. We're all gardeners, so let's talk about milkweed. Milkweed is, again, the only plant that monarch caterpillars can eat. So if we don't have milkweed, we cannot have monarchs. Some interesting facts about milkweed. It contains a cardiac glycoside, which is sequestered, and that means the caterpillar eats the leaves, or they really like to eat the blooms. If the milkweed is blooming, they'll eat the blooms. They'll eat really any part of the plant, and it all contains this cardiac glycoside, and the caterpillar maintains that in their body, and then it's carried into the adult butterfly. Milkweed is also a nectar factory. It produces nectar 24/7. Not all flowers do that. But each of the flowers, if you can see, there's individual flowers in each umbule, and each flower has 5 parts. So there's petals, sepals, hoods, and horns. And they'll form a seed pod, which only happens after a really interesting pollination cycle. So if you're not familiar with milkweed pollination, I'd encourage you to look that up. Could do a whole talk really on milkweed. But there's even other milkweed specialists that really depend on or can only survive if milkweed is available. I do encourage you to plant regionally native milkweed. And if you are purchasing a plant, to ask the grower about neonics in particular, but also about any pesticides that might have been used. Also want to caution anyone who is working with milkweed that the sap is really hazardous. And the one thing you never want to do is have milkweed sap on your fingers and then touch your eye. It can cause blindness. So if that would happen, I would encourage you to seek medical advice right away. All right, so I'm going to talk about several species of milkweed. And as I do that, you'll probably want to know where you can buy it if there's one that piques your interest. Your local nursery may have a few varieties, but hopefully I've convinced you that you should ask about pesticide use. Really, a native plant nursery is the best place to start. Most native plant growers that I know aren't using any pesticides, and Ohio is rich with options for native plants. So one place that you can visit to find out more, or get a list, I should say, of native plant vendors in Ohio is the Ohio Native Plant Month website. So www.ohionativeplantmonth.org, and they have a list of the native plant vendors that might possibly be able to supply you with milkweed. I know Marina had mentioned that this is Ohio Native Plant Month. I just wanted to mention that again, and also to shout out to the Ohio Native Plant Month folks for getting it adopted nationally. So April is also now National Native Plant Month. All right, so let's go into some different species of milkweed. The first up, my favorite, which I believe is just preferred for monarchs looking for a place to lay eggs, is the common milkweed. So this is the one you would probably see growing along the side of the road. It gets pretty tall. It can be aggressive because it spreads by underground rhizomes. So you plant one stalk this year, and next year you might have 3, and the following year you might have 16, and they're all coming from one plant, so that it's a clone. It's so fragrant. It smells so good. If you haven't smelled a common milkweed bloom before, I would encourage you to do that this summer. Also, there are tons of pollinators that visit milkweeds at night because they're that 24/7 nectar producer. So if you've never gone outside with your flashlight to look at your milkweed, do that when it's in bloom, and you might be surprised what you find. It's really loved by pollinators. Probably number 2, although some people would argue with me and say this is number 1 when it comes to a female monarch looking for a place to lay eggs, is the swamp milkweed. The nursery trade has tried to rename this, so you might see it labeled as rose milkweed because milkweed for one has a bad taste in mouths, but when you add swamp, it really does not need a swamp. It does prefer to have more moisture than other milkweeds, but really it can tolerate a lot of different soils and not need extra water unless we're in an extreme drought. It's really good if you have a rain garden or an area of your yard that kind of fills up with water and might stand for a day or 2 after we've had a hard rain. This is perfect for that. It also will do really well in a pot. So if all you have is a balcony or a deck with sunny conditions, I would say plant a swamp milkweed, and you can also then ensure that it gets enough water that way. The picture you see on the left, the white one, that's actually a cultivar. It's known as ice ballet, and that might be one that you would find again at a local nursery. It's okay as a host plant, so the caterpillars can eat it and grow just fine, but it may not be as attractive for pollinators because it has a different color flower. And sometimes when cultivars are created, there's something that's that has to be compromised, and a lot of times that's nectar or pollen. This one, the butterfly weed, or Asclepias tuberosa, is probably the one you'll find most often in a nursery, especially the big box stores. But again, big box stores, you can't generally ask how they grew the plant. They probably have no idea. So it might be best just to pass those on by. There is a cultivar that you might find called Hello Yellow. So of course, by the name, hopefully you know that it has a yellow flower. But they found it may not have the same high quality nectar. So it may not be as attractive to pollinators. But when this one's in bloom, it's also covered in lots of different things. This one needs complete dryness. So full sun. Most of our milkweeds, although I do have a couple of them that I'll show you that can tolerate shade, but most of them will take as much sun as you can throw at them. This is a butterfly weed look-alike. It's an annual or tropical milkweed. And if I go back to the previous slide, you can see where the native butterfly weed is solid orange, or like I said, there might be a yellow cultivar, where the tropical or annual has typically bicolor flowers. Don't buy this one. This again, it's tropical. So it will be an annual here in Ohio. There's some evidence that this might affect migratory behavior of monarchs because it stays in bloom for so long. It might encourage a female monarch to become sexually active and then stay around and lay eggs, which would be too late to develop. There's also a higher probability, because this is one you would have to buy in a traditional nursery, that it's been treated with neonics. There's something else that I would encourage you to avoid. I'll just give you some clues. It's a plant from Asia, and now it's spreading out of control along stream banks and all other areas around the country. It's the butterfly bush. Each butterfly bush produces over 100,000 seeds, and they're distributed in the wind. So even though you might not see seedlings popping up in your garden, your butterfly bush may be responsible for spreading devastation in natural areas like stream banks or disturbed industrial sites. And not a single native caterpillar eats butterfly bush leaves. What should you plant instead? I'm so glad you asked. Butterfly bush can be replaced with something called button bush. When button bush is in bloom, it doesn't have as long of a bloom period as the butterfly bush, but it's native and it will be covered in pollinators galore. Did you notice in the previous slide that the pollinator I had on the button bush was not a monarch? In fact, it was a viceroy, which is a monarch look-alike that's not at all related to the monarch. So the viceroy, there's photos here on the left-hand side, both the upper and under wings, and the monarch is on the right. The viceroy uses what's called Batesian mimicry, which means it's resembling the monarch because monarchs are unpalatable. So the caterpillars ate all of that milkweed, which has sequestered that cardioglycoside that makes birds vomit if they eat one. So the viceroy mimics the monarch to possibly protect itself from predators. So if I go back to the previous slide, you can see, and one big indicator is the line that extends across the wing of the viceroy. The monarch doesn't have that. Viceroys are also a much smaller butterfly species, and they have pretty erratic flight. So they're pretty active, where monarchs are pretty calm and cool and collected. Back to the milkweed. Sullivan's milkweed is actually one of my favorites, although I have never found a monarch caterpillar. I've seen a few eggs, but I think the leaves are thick enough to gum up their mouths, and so the caterpillars may not really prefer that. It is a prairie species, so I'm sure that the monarchs can use it, but I consider it more of an ornamental. It's not as tall, not as aggressive as the common milkweed, not as fragrant either. This is one you could grow in the shade. So if all you have is shade, grab this milkweed, poke milkweed. The flowers are drooping. You can see the stems there on the flowers are much longer. This one's also not very aggressive, gets pretty tall. Not used as much because you typically would not find a monarch butterfly in a shaded location. So in the wooded areas, but if you have a space along the edge of a wooded area that gets shade a good amount of the day, this would be a good one. I really love the milkweed vine, also called sand vine or honey vine. It's Cynantium laevi. So it's not an Asclepias, but it is a host plant for the monarchs, as well as some of our other monarch specialists, like the milkweed tussock moth. This is a vine, so it's perfect for fences or a trellis. It can be aggressive, so you do want to give it something to climb, or it will find its own vertical structure to climb, and that might be another plant that you wouldn't want covered by a vine. It's not as aggressive as bindweed or morning glory, and it's also doesn't twine as tightly as those ones, so it is a lot easier to remove if you would find a need to do that. The common name honey vine is because those flowers, even though they're pretty small, they do smell like honey. It will grow in shade. I have some in full all-day shade, and I also have it in full hot blazing sun. And the plants that grow in the shade have much larger leaves than the ones that grow in the sun. It will also get a pod, just like milkweed. So a perfect way to find if you have it is to go out right now. And if you see a vine covering a fence or a plant, and it has a pod that looks like a milkweed pod, that is most likely going to be the milkweed vine. The vines are really easy to use if you are rearing any monarchs. So those ones that I rear for education, I'll use a lot of the milkweed vine. I've never found it for sale, which is one of the reasons why I added it to my plant list. But just as important as milkweed is to the caterpillars, plants that produce high quality nectar are important to the butterflies. And fall blooming plants are critical for the migration. So you can see my 4 favorite that are here on this slide. We have the blazing star, the Liatris. There's several different native varieties that all have different characteristics and are just wonderful. Blue mist flower, a lot of native plant vendors will carry blue mist flower, and it has a very long bloom time. It looks a lot like the cultivated ageratum, except it's taller. And then the native asters, as opposed to the garden asters that are typically sold in garden centers, look for a New England aster or a smooth blue, smooth blue aster, or any of the goldenrods, the native goldenrods. And there's more than just the one you see along the highway. Goldenrods come in lots of different varieties as well that are short, tall, grow in the shade, different characteristics there as well. Another way to help is to get involved. And I have mentioned the Monarch joint venture, but they have a website with lots of resources. They do lots of monitoring and have different programs for conservation. One in particular that I think is kind of cool is their Monarchs in the Rough program, which is developed for golf courses. So if you're a golfer, or you have a golfer in the house, maybe talk to the golf course and see if they would be interested in putting in some pollinator habitat that includes monarch beneficials. Journey North, you can participate in reporting your sightings. Monarch Watch has a monarch way station program. So if you develop monarch habitat, you can self-certify that and get a registered monarch way station on the map. They also do the tagging. So just as Fred and Nora Urquhart did the original tagging, Monarch Watch now has taken over tagging, which still continues today. Also, the Wild Ones is a national organization that focuses on native plants, but they received a grant this year from the Monarch joint venture to develop additional materials for support of monarch butterflies and for doing public education. So we should start seeing more out of Wild Ones. And there's several Ohio chapters of Wild Ones. So there's a chapter in Akron, one in Columbus, Dayton, and Toledo. You know, it's so easy to feel that the actions we can take couldn't possibly make any difference. But then I think about the hundreds of milkweed plants that I've personally encouraged people to plant. Hopefully I have a few new planters. I've also persuaded farmers to leave milkweed standing next to their fields. They now mow around it. But also the children, the adults, and senior citizens who may have become inspired to create habitat after learning more about monarchs and watching the monarch life cycle. So during this Earth Day month, ask yourself, what actions will you take? Because if it's not you and me, then who will take those actions? Will you have a haven for the monarchs that will be returning soon? Will she find a safe place for her eggs? And will there be a safe place where that next generation can survive? So you can visit my website for the names and descriptions of the plants that I mentioned, except for the buttonbush, because I don't carry buttonbush. But there's a catalog on the website that has full descriptions of those. But right now, I guess I'll go ahead and see if there's any questions I might be able to answer.